Hello and welcome to UnHerd. I'm Freddie Sayers. So here at UnHerd, we're always looking for new, interesting sources of information, things a little bit off the beaten track that might give us some advantage over what we're reading in the establishment media. Well, one area is, of course, the financial markets. Normally, I'm pretty dismissive of them. It's just another herd, another group, and we shouldn't pay too much attention. But recently, I've been paying a bit more attention to what financial analysts are saying, mainly because in the past few months, they seem to conclude that Omicron was much less of a threat a long time before the establishment scientists and governments came to the same conclusion. They were already piling into opening up stocks and companies that would do well if Omicron wasn't bad way before Christmas, before people in politics seemed to acknowledge that reality. So I think the record over the course of the pandemic is actually pretty good. And recently, a paper came across my desk by someone called Louis-Vincent Gave, and he is a financial analyst, and he's a co-founder of Gavekal, which is a financial services firm based in Hong Kong. And he's joining us to tell us about it. Hi, Louis.
Hello, Freddie. Thanks a lot for having me.
We saw a report that you wrote focusing on vaccines and on the vaccine stocks that kind of leapt out as potentially interesting and showed how the world of finance is looking at what is happening in this sort of final stage of the pandemic slightly differently. You're focusing on the stock prices and the market capitalizations of the big pharma companies. And you've noticed basically that they come all the way down and they're nearly back where they started.
That's exactly right. Well, thanks for having me. And first, from your lips to God's ears, in terms of this being the final stages of this pandemic. But yes, I mean, if you take a stock like Moderna, before Moderna announced its vaccines, it had roughly $800 million in sales, and it was a loss-making company, just as many biotech companies are loss-making. The vaccines got rolled out; it's a big hit for them. A year later, their sales are 17 billion. They have more than 6 billion in profits. So this is the home run to end all home run, right? I mean, if you were an investor in Moderna pre the release of the vaccine, you think you've obviously hit the bank. And the stock, does rally dramatically. But really, since this summer, it's now down 75% to basically the same level as you were back when you were an $800 million in sales company with losses.
We've actually got a chart. Louis, let me just put the chart up if we can, which shows the Moderna share price and the market cap at a couple of different points. So March 2020, before we have really cottoned on to the COVID-19, it's around a $9 billion company. That then obviously increases dramatically as investors are thinking they're going to produce these valuable vaccines. So before they announced the successful vaccine trial on November the 15th, 2020, it is worth $35 billion. And that rises to an eye-popping $195 billion in September of last year, which is the peak. And as you mentioned, it's been crashing pretty much since then. It's still not back to obviously pre-pandemic levels or even pre-announcement levels, but it's roughly back to sort of end of 2021 levels.
Exactly. And I think if you look at, today's $65 billion market cap valuation, and you look at, the company's $6 billion in profits, so that's now a stock that's trading at 10 times earnings, which in today's markets, 10 times earnings is, it's given away in the street. You wouldn't expect a name that's now become pretty much a household brand, right? I mean, everybody knows the name Moderna. They don't need to spend any money doing PR. They don't need to spend any money doing advertising. They have, these contracts with governments that are just going to spew money for the coming years. You wouldn't expect that to trade at 10 times earnings, yet here we are.
So in other words, the financial world is looking at a stock like Moderna and concluding that its future is not as bright as all that.
Yeah, now arguably you could say, well, that's what happens to sort of, one product companies, right? And if to your point, we are reaching the end of the pandemic, then indeed, maybe, the need to go out and get vaccinated every 6 months won't be there anymore, and therefore Moderna will perhaps have to reinvent itself. And I'll add just one more thing is, the rollover started really hard even before Omicron. If we look at Omicron, the hope is that indeed it's much more contagious but far less deadly. So it's basically our path out of the pandemic, right? Basically everybody gets it, builds up natural immunity, and we move on. The interesting thing about the vaccines is they really stopped collapsing. They really stopped rising and started collapsing really in the summer. Maybe the markets were starting to realize these vaccines aren't quite as efficient as we hoped they would be.
Let's dig into that, because that is the kind of interesting story here, and we've got to be very careful around this topic because it becomes very sensitive. But the thesis of your paper, which is the one I read, was that the markets have basically taken a look at the efficacy of these vaccines and are unimpressed, underwhelmed.
Well, so I think first we have to distinguish efficacy and efficiency. Efficacy is determined by randomized health trials run by healthcare companies. Efficiency is what you observe in the real world. Now, when it comes to the efficacy, unfortunately, we'll never really know, since the trials that were done, as soon as they were finished, as soon as the drugs were approved, everybody got the vaccine anyway. So all we have to go on is efficiency.
Well, I hate to interrupt, but I just got to interject there, which is that actually the efficacy is already an important part of this story, isn't it? Because when the vaccines were first announced in November 2020, we had this very quick succession suite of announcements from Pfizer and then Moderna and then the Russian vaccine, and all of them miraculously were 95% effective. It was like, whoa, that's amazing. All three companies have 95% efficacy, and efficacy is defined as not getting the disease. That's what it means. They wouldn't have got FDA approval for any efficacy number under 50%. That was the standard that had been set already by the FDA. But now, studies that have come out even in the last month or so, including by Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, are saying that for one or two of these mRNA vaccines against Omicron, we are dramatically under 50% efficacy. Estimates range from 30%, occasionally people say 40%, some people say single digits percentage of efficacy. So, efficacy on its own is not what was originally promised. In fact, dramatically far from it.
And which might explain the drop in the share price. Occam's razor would tend to tell us, the company promises something on the product, and that something doesn't quite deliver, then the share price rolls over. It's not an uncommon tale in financial markets to have managements overpromise and underdeliver. And usually, what happens when managements do this, when they overpromise and underdeliver, is you end up with shifting goalposts. You end up, management saying, okay, well, we promised this, but we didn't deliver this, so we'll deliver that instead, and that is just as good. Which is, I think, sort of where we are today, right? When it comes to these vaccines. To your point, when they came out, we were promised, go get vaccinated and you won't get sick. So we all did it. We all went to get vaccinated, and then we still got sick. And so then it became, go get vaccinated and you won't spread the disease. But as you point out, everybody got Omicron. I got it. I assume a bunch of people in your office got it because everybody I know got it. And now, of course, I think the rhetoric coming from the vaccine companies is, but yes, everybody still got sick and everybody still spread it around, but nobody dies anymore. So it reduces the effects of the disease dramatically, which is where we are today. Basically saying, look, if we look at the people coming into hospital, between those who are vaccinated and those who aren't vaccinated, the people who are vaccinated are ending up with much better outcomes than the people who aren't vaccinated. I think there's an inherent problem with that argument, though. And the problem with that argument is these are not randomized trials. These are self-selecting groups. You're sort of comparing apples and oranges. I'll give you a quick example. I live in Canada, and in Canada, 90% of the people are vaccinated, and the very vast majority, well, out of that 10%, um, that aren't vaccinated, you find really two main groups. The first group is the First Nations, the Aboriginal people of Canada, who are very vaccine reluctant. So that's one group and I understand that in Britain, a lot of minorities are also vaccine reluctant. So that's one group. The other group of people who aren't vaccinated are very often people who are very sick and therefore can't take the hit of getting vaccinated or getting a booster. It's people who are, in care homes and towards the end of their lives. And this is an issue you see with the flu vaccine all the time. This is an issue that, you go to a care home, very weak people don't get the flu vaccine, and strong people do. So inherently, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? Because that it's a very sad thing, but in most countries, poorer people tend to have worse health outcomes, and that's just unfortunately a reality. That maybe they don't go to the doctor as much, maybe they don't have as good lifestyle choices, maybe they don't eat as well, for a whole host of reasons. While rich people tend to have much better health outcomes. So when you look at most countries, rich people have taken the vaccines and poor people typically haven't. And the more marginalized the population, the less it's taken the vaccines. And so you're comparing health outcomes between marginalized populations and between non-marginalized populations. So
your sense is, you're looking at this with the kind of analyst's brain, as you would look at any other product, and you think that maybe the goalposts might be shifting again, and even some of the claims that are made today about the vaccines may not necessarily stand up in forthcoming months or years, and somehow that might explain why the share prices are down so much.
I think there's that. And I think if we look through the vaccinated versus unvaccinated data in wealthy countries, you're looking at flawed samples to begin with. So it's better to look at overall country data. So you can take a country like Israel, where everybody's had their third booster and all the over 60s have had their fourth booster. You can look at the results of Israel against, say, a country like South Africa. South Africa, who was the first with Omicron, where Omicron spread widely, and where only 30% of the population got just one dose.
So I think we've got some charts here as well, Louis, because this was on your paper that I saw, this country comparison, and it did seem interesting. So let's have a look at the first chart on that.
Exactly. So this is, Israel is a fairly fully vaccinated country by this point. South Africa is pretty far from it, which again goes to the same dichotomies we have internally within our own countries, right? With sort of richer people typically vaccinated and poorer people typically not, which is what you have in the world. Poorer nations are not vaccinated, richer nations are. So looking at this chart, you would expect Israel to have a much better outcome with Omicron than South Africa, right? Because if the vaccines work, if they work as promised, Israel should be crushing South Africa's numbers. What's very odd is that this isn't happening. If you look at hospitalizations, which is your bottom chart, and red is Israel, blue is South Africa, you find that for some reason, although Israel's all fully vaccinated and boosted, etc., hospitalizations in Israel today are twice what they were last winter, when in South Africa were much lower than last winter. This is odd, right? This goes against the narrative that that basically vaccines are dramatically helping hospitalizations.
So I mean, I'm just going to come up with a couple of potential critiques of this, if I could. So the first, which is what everyone will say, I think, initially, is that the demographics are different, and that South Africa has a much younger population than Israel. I would expect that to be true. Can't that explain the difference?
It definitely can, but you're still left with, South Africa's population and Israel's population demographic makeup have not dramatically changed in the past 18 months, right? It's roughly the same it was 18 months ago. So Israel didn't all of a sudden get massively old in just 18 months. So why is Israel having twice as much hospitalization as a year ago?
Okay, well, here's my theory number two then. Louis. What about Israel's testing is much more assiduous than South Africa. And therefore, they test everyone coming into hospital. And if they're in hospital for anything with COVID, and pretty much everybody seems to have COVID at the moment in a country like Israel, they go down as a COVID admissions. Maybe that is what explains the big red spike at the end of the Israel one, that it's actually a kind of overzealousness with testing.
That's very, very possible. So if you looked at that first chart, indeed, you see testing go absolutely. You see cases go through the roof in Israel. So I do believe indeed that one of the problems, in the West, we do test massively and all the time. So we are going to end up with more cases. The more you test, the more cases you get. There's no doubt. Which is why cases is a poor measure to begin with. Except that if you go to the death numbers, and here supposedly the death numbers are really people who die of COVID, not who died with COVID. I think initially in the first sort of wave of the pandemic, health officials were pretty quick to put died of COVID sticker on anybody who died with COVID. But this is really abated now, and the data is now better. And so if you look at the death numbers and you compare Israel to South Africa, again, Israel is making new highs in terms of people dying of COVID, as we are here in Canada. In Canada, we're 90% vaccinated. We're back to record highs this winter of people dying of COVID.
It's definitely true, I would say, Louis, that if you zoom out, it's not easy to prove the case on a macro country by country comparison that the countries that are highly vaccinated are having better outcomes than the countries that are less vaccinated. I mean, there is all sorts of potential confounding variables, and people can argue about it to the kind of cows come home. But if it was that simple, you would see more of a easy correlation.
I think so. I think that's exactly right. And remember, put yourself back in December when Omicron came out. Do you remember the press? And we were being told that South Africa was going to be one big open morgue, that they wouldn't be able to burn the bodies fast enough. And fast forward a couple months, and there's been nothing of the sort. South Africa has churned along and is completely fine, as is India, as is pretty much as is most of Africa, as is most of Latin America, and by this point the disease has spread.
The kind of relative lack of stellar performance by these vaccines is ironically good news in terms of an economy like China, or the effect it has on the wider economy, because it means that it's much harder to make the case to stay shut down. It's much harder to prosecute these kind of more extreme policies if it's becoming pretty obvious that the effect is more marginal.
Exactly. I think it's great news, in fact, for all emerging markets. To the extent that vaccines are no longer going to create this big difference between the haves and the have-nots in terms of vaccines, I think it has to be good news.
So if we kind of zoom out a bit, one thing that interests me is that a lot of people who are skeptical or questioning about the whole COVID experience ask questions about Big Pharma, companies precisely like Moderna. We've seen the enormous lift to the share price that happened because of the pandemic. And they think in some way, is Big Pharma kind of benefiting from this? The story you're telling is that they're not. So actually, in a way, this is a reassuring piece of information, because it seems like if Big Pharma is somehow manipulating this whole thing for profiteering motives, they're not doing a very good job of it, because the share prices are crashing.
So, no, look, they have benefited. Again, Moderna was a company making massive losses on 800 million of sales two years ago. It's now making $6 or $7 billion a year. So that's proper money, right? And if you're the Moderna CEO, this has given you opportunities to sell stocks along the way at a much higher price. And I'm not begrudging it.
Do you think that's fair, Louis? I mean, because we're getting to this sort of a story there, which is that these kind of Big Pharma executives were selling on the way up, knowing that these vaccines would be disappointing and are kind of out already. But I think there was a big kind of conspiracy story about the Moderna CEO that was doing the rounds on social media on the weekend, that he had deleted his Twitter account and he had sold a bunch of shares, and everyone thought, right, this is proof of some malfeasance. But I think looking into it, it looks like he sold, I mean, $1.8 million or something, not very much in his terms, which was a pre-scheduled share sale across a 2-year period. It doesn't quite stack up, does it? That they've kind of sold out and run away.
Yeah, no, which is, whenever you look at executive sales, that's what you find always. It's for the past 10 years, people have been saying, oh, Facebook is going to crash because, Mark Zuckerberg is selling shares, and, he's just been selling shares along the way. I think the only executive that has really never sold any of his shares is Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Almost all CEOs sell shares along the way. You may want to see how much of their shares they sell, but, from one transaction, you can only infer so much.
So there was a sort of over-enthusiasm, you might say, a kind of rush to buy the latest product because it was going to solve all of our problems. And the story, at the very least, we can say for certain, has been less impressive than initially promised.
I think you had, on the one hand, panicked policymakers who were willing to throw anything at anything to get out of the situation that they put themselves in with lockdowns and suspensions of age-old liberties and all the things that they did for years. They were looking at anything for that. And so when somebody comes in and says, hey, I have a solution for that, but you need to write me a big check, and B, you need to suspend all the usual rules you have in terms of approving drugs, i.e., the 5-year studies, the efficacy randomized trials, all these things that we've put in place over decades through really trial and error, right? And figuring out how to, we suspended it all. It's like, oh, you have a vaccine, boom, let's rush that in and throw it out there.
Let me ask you one final question, if I could, Louis, which is the kind of what you referred to at the start, this idea that we would be on a regimen of 3-monthly or 6-monthly booster shots for all eternity in order to be given our passports back or able to function in society. The deduction from what you said and what the financial markets seem to be saying about these stocks is that that's no longer going to happen because 6 months ago, at the high point of the Moderna share price, it did look like that. It looked like maybe this was the new normal. We were just all going to be constantly vaccinated. Should we conclude, you're going to accuse me of searching for more good news here, but should we conclude that that's no longer a realistic future?
Absolutely, and I think we're getting there. Look, you have the chance of living in England. England's already there. The US is already there. Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, more and more countries are moving towards that, towards abandoning vaccine passports, towards abandoning vaccine mandates, and just basically getting on with life. This is true pretty much. This is becoming true in more and more countries. I think that's what the truckers movement in Canada here is about. People looking at the US, people looking at England and saying, well, hold on, if it's like this over there, why isn't it like this here? Why are we still mandated to take our shots every 3 to 6 months when nobody else is?
I said it was my final question. I've got one more, which is just to turn the page a bit. The markets pretty much crashed today. There has been a big slide on the basis of fears of war in Eastern Europe or the Russians invading in Ukraine. What's your take on that? What do you think the markets are factoring in there?
I think we'll see Godot in Kiev before we see any Russian troops. The whole hype is that there's 130,000 Russian troops at the border. Ukraine is a very big country. I think it would take a lot more than 130,000 troops to invade Ukraine.
Louis Gave, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That was Louis Gave, the founding partner of Gavekal, a financial services and analysis firm. His view of the pandemic and the efficiency and efficacy of vaccines was quite optimistic in a way at the end, because he concludes that this huge dividing line, this obsession with vaccines that has been dominating all of our lives for at least a year, will inevitably fade away because the cold reality of their performance consistently underwhelms compared to the original promise. So we shall see if he's right, but it was always interesting to hear a different perspective. Thanks to him, and thanks to you for tuning in. This was UnHerd.